Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance discussion. Thank you so much for joining us on Zoom. Our topic today, suicide, is a difficult one to discuss, but certainly necessary and has become all too familiar to many of us, both professionally and personally. Before we begin our conversation with Dr. Baiden, a little administrative housekeeping. If your organization is not a member of the Research America Alliance, I really hope you'll reach out to my colleague Joel, our Director of Membership, whose email is in the chat. Thank you. So today we are very grateful to be joined by suicide prevention researcher, Dr. Philip Baiden. Dr. Baiden is an associate professor at the University of Texas at Arlington's School of Social Work. We've invited Dr. Baiden to talk with us about his research on childhood and adolescent risk factors for suicide and how our society can do a much better job of supporting those in need. So welcome, Dr. Baiden.
Thank you, Jenny, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
To get us started, tell us a little bit about your research. What brought you to where you are today? How did you get interested in this topic?
Yeah, thank you. I've always been interested in research that prioritizes children and vulnerable individuals or vulnerable population. And I got interested in the line of adverse childhood experience and suicide research around 2010 when I finished my master's at University of Western Ontario in Canada. I got an opportunity to work at a tertiary care residential facility for children and youth. And whilst working there as a research coordinator, I do discover through conversation with clinicians and staff about the rise in self-harm among children on the facility. And most of the children also have trauma issues that from their home and have a history of child welfare involvement. So I got very interested in finding out how conditions in which they grew up in the household is impacting their mental health, particularly self-harm. And during my PhD, I furthered that interest more closely looking at those who experience childhood adversity, particularly physical, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse, and how that impacts their self-harm and suicide behavior. So that has been what brought me to this line of work. And I also approach this from a social determinant perspective, social determinant of health perspective, where I don't just look at the individual factors, but also structural factors that predispose some families and children to be at risk of adverse childhood experiences and suicide thoughts and behaviors.
Wow. Okay, that's really helpful to understand the context of your research. Can you say a little bit more about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, I guess, in the psychology jargon? How do you define and identify them? And how do they relate to suicidal behaviors among youth?
Yes, thank you. So adverse childhood experiences, which we generally abbreviate to mean ACEs, these are stressful or traumatic events that typically occurs before the age of 18 that an individual experience. And the most commonly cited ACEs we know in the literature include physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, parental incarceration, domestic violence, household mental illness, substance use in the household, or parental separation or divorce. However, recently, there has been a push to include or to expand that definition of ACEs to also take into account experiences of children who are experiencing homelessness or who are unhoused, those who are also experiencing bullying, be it school bullying or cyberbullying. And now we also do know about community violence, poverty, and as well as housing inequality or experiences of racial discrimination equally have the same devastating effects on the individual brain and life outcome as sexual abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. With respect to the linkage, the mechanism through which ACEs affects health and mental health outcome is very varied, but the research that shows that the ACEs can trigger a unique stress response and disrupt ordinary child development. Stress is part of life, is part of human life, but there are various levels. And here I will note three different types of stress where we have positive stress response, which is normal stress that a child may experience if, for instance, he or she is about to get vaccinated. The child may feel stressful, but with the vaccination needed, and the child will be okay. And we also have some tolerable stress response where if somebody loses a loved one or somebody was involved in a car accident, it comes with stress. But when there is the right support mechanism, tolerable stress can become manageable. It is when children don't get the right support or mechanism that tolerable stress then become toxic stress. And the toxic stress goes on to affect the brain composition, how the brain responds to other life events, which then impact various chronic conditions, including suicide. And we do know from research that children who experience 4 or more adversities, they are sometimes about 7 times more likely to engage in substance use later in adulthood and 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. So the impact of ACEs on suicide is very enormous and requires a lot of concerted effort to address it.
So you've pulled together what I think is called the Youth Suicide Research Consortium, and which my understanding is it's somewhat of a novel approach to sharing the information about the risk factors and how to address them. Can you talk about the consortium and the difference that it's making?
Yes, that's a very important question, and thank you for asking. So the Youth Suicide Research Consortium is a group of researchers across the United States that is being led by Dr. Regina Mirinda from Hunter College in New York. And it's basically a group of suicide researchers that focuses primarily on how to prevent suicide among youth. And we do have a diverse expertise and background focusing primarily on how do we prevent suicide, especially among youth and marginalized population. And I have focused more on suicide among Black youth within the consortium, doing research to identify risk factors and what are some protective factors, particularly among Black youth, that we can harness as a community to prevent suicide. We also focus on cutting-edge research that can support clinicians and practitioners on how best to identify those who are at risk and how to prevent it. We also working with different partners on developing interventions to be used in school settings, in community settings, and in hospital and clinical settings, all with the aim of preventing suicide among youth. So the consortium, it's a very active and vibrant group that is constantly working both in academia and partnering with community agencies on preventing suicide among youth.
Perhaps we can put a link in the chat if people want more information about the Youth Suicide Research Consortium.
Yes, I think that would be helpful. We can share that link.
Great. Well, we'll see if we can find that. So what are some of the strategies and interventions that the consortium has found to be, constructive?
Yes, thank you. So when it comes to the prevention of suicide thoughts and behaviors or intervention, first and foremost, we believe that effective suicide prevention should first address thoughts of suicide and suicidal behavior directly during treatment instead of focusing solely on the symptoms that we do know are associated with suicide. For instance, symptoms such as hopelessness, depression, anxiety, or quality of life. Those are symptoms that, when present, increases the risk of suicide thoughts and behaviors astronomically. But when it comes to prevention, the research shows that intervention should focus directly at preventing the thought of suicide and the actual attempts and behaviors. And here we have interventions such as cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, social skills training, as well as simple interventions such as supportive telephone calls or letters are very effective in preventing suicide thoughts and behaviors. Within the school environment, intervention also such as social and emotional learning skills has been found to be very effective, where children and adolescents are taught about how to manage their emotion, how to regulate emotion, how to reach out for support when in crisis or when in need, are also equally very effective. Physical activity is also one promising intervention that has been used in preventing other mental health. And the research also shows that when it comes to suicide, regular physical activity helps the brain process stress, which can also help prevent suicide thoughts and behaviors.
So, Dr. Baiden, just to make sure I understand, so are you saying that while it's important to focus on depression, sadness, and um, sort of mood, different moods that might exacerbate suicidal thoughts, you actually have very specific interventions to deal with the suicidal thoughts themselves? And is that part of what you're encouraging, is the cognitive behavior, for example? So if someone is experiencing suicidal thoughts, they're taught certain techniques they can use to move away from those thoughts. Am I understanding this correctly?
Exactly, because the research has shown that while it is important to address hopelessness, depression, mood-related factors, those alone don't really, addressing those alone is not sufficient enough. So when we target direct intervention, as you mentioned, cognitive behavioral therapy, which goes to the underlying thoughts and behaviors, have been found to be more effective than solely addressing the risk factors or the symptoms. So dialectic behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy are very effective and have shown lots of promise in treating those who have a history of suicide attempts. So yes, we need to address mental health holistically by looking at the symptoms, hopelessness, feeling sad, depression, anxiety, and those who feel there is no purpose of living. We need to address those symptoms, but we get a better promise when we directly address the underlying suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And this is where CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and dialectic behavior therapy has shown a lot of promise and has been very effective, as well as supportive telephone calls, constant in touch with those who are feeling lonely and have withdrawn from activities that we know they used to do in the past. All of a sudden, they've withdrawn. Addressing those has shown a lot of promise in terms of preventing suicide thoughts and behaviors.
So, I mean, I'm not in any way an expert in this area, but from what I've understood, and now you're really bringing this home for me, that society used to think of suicide as the result of depression, the result of sadness, the result of hopelessness, but we're starting to define it more, or maybe even now, not just starting, but fully defining it more as, a separate behavior that requires its own intervention. So I
Yes.
think that's really interesting, because that's a societal shift, I think, in terms of how we think about suicide and how we go about addressing it. It's actually quite hopeful in a way.
Yeah, it is hopeful and promising, especially when we come to understand that those risk factors, when present, we tackle those risk factors, we have a chance of reducing the presence of those risk factors.
Sure.
But the underlying thoughts and behaviors are also what we also need to be getting at.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to addressing that, we do know from research that some individuals don't even, who attempt suicide or die from suicide, don't sometimes show any signs of thought or ideation about suicide. So about 1 in 4 individuals who attempt suicide have no history of suicidal thoughts. And this is why it becomes important that we focus on addressing the underlying thoughts and behaviors. It is important to also not ignore the mental health symptoms when it comes to suicide thoughts and behaviors, depression, anxiety, mood-related behavior. But there has to be a shift focusing on how best to effectively address the suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And this is where cognitive behavior therapy and dialectic behavior therapy has been very effective, both in addressing suicidal thoughts and behavior, both in the general population and in clinical samples. Clinically depressed individuals have also benefit tremendously in preventing their suicidal thoughts and behaviors when they partake in CBT as a therapy or as an intervention.
For those of us who are listening today who are not trained in psychology, I mean, CBT, is you can read about it in popular literature, but perhaps you could just explain some of the fundamental aspects of it. Thank you.
Yeah, so cognitive behavior therapy, it's an intervention that focuses first on addressing the underlying cognition and thought processes that individuals have, particularly when it comes to trauma-related events. So the focus is on addressing the cognitive thoughts and behaviors. And there are various steps and processes that during the cognitive behavior therapy intervention, individuals go through. So they are taught to utilize those skills that when in crisis or when experiencing thoughts about feeling depressed, sad, or hopeless, those skills and tools that they learn during the CBT therapy comes in very handy in helping them cope with the moment, which then prevent the occurrence of suicidal thoughts and behaviors.
Thank you. So let's talk about social media. What are some of the strategies that social platforms could adopt to safeguard the well-being of young users? And in fact, I should take a step backwards and ask you, what risk are they posing now? And how do we help to lessen that risk? And then are there ways that they could be incorporated into positive interventions?
Yeah, thank you. The role of social media when it comes to suicide, it's very enormous. And we do know that social media has now become a part of our life. And with that come its benefits and challenges, or what I would say disadvantages. So social media offers young individuals, opportunity to connect with families, with friends, loved ones. For instance, within the LGBTQ community, it's a great avenue for them to get support and get ideas on the coming out process and how to deal with all the aftermath or the issues that come with that. Now, with that also comes the risk. And because it plays a pivotal role in galvanizing youth as a place where they seek support and comfort, there are also individuals who use that as an avenue to bully and to harass youth. So we do see a lot of harassment when it comes to cyberbullying. And the issue with cyberbullying is that whatever that is posted or the form of harassment that occurs there has a potential of reaching a wider audience and also the potential of staying on for longer period. The longer the abuse stays online or takes place, makes it very difficult for individual to cope or to do away with the trauma that they experience whilst online. Now, also related to that is the notion that whatever youth are seeing on social media is actually real. And this has made it very challenging for youth to question themselves and to question their body positivity or body image. So we do know, for instance, on Instagram, Facebook, and other social media, that there is an enormous pressure on teens, particularly adolescent females, to present a certain body image, to present a certain image about themselves. Whereas some don't know that all that it's presented on social media is actually not real, it's actually not true. So with that, makes it difficult for some youth to question, especially those who don't have much self-esteem, to question themselves, their perception, and see, why are they different from what their peers, how their peers present themselves online. So with that comes a lot of depression, a lot of self-doubt that makes it challenging. So when it comes to social media, it's becoming sort of a bane in terms of the mental health of adolescents. But with respect to prevention or what can be done, there are some strategies. For instance, turning off geolocation could be one, because we do know about those who prey on young individuals reach out to them through unscrupulous means in order to befriend them, and through that process lure them into unhealthy behaviors and other activities that are very harmful to youth. So turning off geolocation is a very important one. Youth also should be reminded about what they post has the potential of living online for longer than they may think. So they have to think, pause before they post. But I also don't want to put the blame, so the responsibility solely on youth in terms of how to protect themselves. They certainly has to take efforts in protecting themselves, but the social media companies also has to make sure that third parties are prevented from phishing and reaching out to vulnerable youth when it comes to some advertising. When youth are presented information that suggests that this is the right thing to do, or this is how they have to live, and this is how they have to present themselves, it has the potential of harming them. So the social media company has a huge role. They have a responsibility in ensuring that third parties are not being brought onto those platforms that has the potential of harming youth.
It's a big issue, I know. And I know that's something that, the APA and other groups are certainly working on. I'm going to ask you a couple more questions, but I encourage the audience to share their questions as well. We'll be turning to your questions in a minute. So the pandemic, obviously the isolation caused by the pandemic led to a spike in depression and many mental health challenges among, a variety of age groups, but did impact young people, young adults, particularly hard. What lessons have you and your colleagues learned from this surge? And can we better prepare mental health of youth in times of crisis and uncertainty in the future? What have we learned that can help us going forward?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Well, I would say that the pandemic, whilst it disrupted a lot of our lives, has really presented us with a clear case of what we call an intervention study, whereby we see what happens, what we know before the pandemic and during the pandemic and post. Some will say we are still in the pandemic, but relative post-pandemic, in a sense that the pandemic brought about lots of businesses, schools shut down, closed. We're asked to social distance, limit our interactions with one another, and not partake in regular activities that we are known to do. And particularly for children who were asked to stay home, it really affected the emotional well-being. Children thrive well in the school environment and with their peers and teachers who know how best to handle them. But here is an instance where pandemic made it difficult for children to go to school. The lockdown meant that children have to stay at home with parents and not have any opportunity to socialize, to learn basic skills on the playground, how to relate with their peers, how to manage their anger, how to manage the relationship with friends, and how to know that when it comes to certain activities, it is important to wait your turn and to take turns. But by being home for that extended period of time, some children have lost some of those social skills that they can use to manage their anger and their mental well-being. So when school reopened, we saw a spike in violence-related activities in school. We saw loss of interest in activity, physical activity, which is very important in their emotional and mental well-being. They were not engaging in it during the pandemic. So we saw a lot of mental health issues relating to the fact that kids were simply not able to reach out, to go out and interact with friends and partake in those physical activities. Being home also meant that they spend time on their devices, on their technology. So how to and manage new friendships became sort of awkward and a challenge. So, and we do know the importance of social connection and social support in reducing suicide thoughts and behavior. So the pandemic has really taught us, and if there's anything we learn from it, is that never again should we allow an opportunity like this where we rob children of these valuable social relations that they have with their peers at school and how to manage their emotional outbursts when they are confronted. So I would say that, yes, the pandemic came with its issues and problems, but when it comes to children, it has really devastated their mental health and well-being. And we need to find ways that should something like this happen in the future, we take steps to ensure that at least the schools are supported in a way that they can run safely, that children can be in school and learn things in the classroom and also outside the classroom to build those social skills that they can rely on when in times that they need it, where they have emotional problems.
Dr. Baiden, we're going to turn to audience questions, but one I wanted to pose, and we can come back to it as well, but many of us on the audience are research advocates. And so, are there particular federal, sources of federal funding that are important to this work? Is it SAMHSA, National Institute of Mental Health? I'm curious where you and your colleagues have gotten their research funding, and where, we should be focused in terms of ensuring that this work that you're doing can continue.
Yeah, so I will start with funding. There are a number of funding agencies that have prioritized suicide research and adverse childhood experiences, particularly among children, adolescents, and young adults. We do know about the National Institute of Mental Health. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has violence funding related to how to prevent violence and injury. The Substance Abuse Mental Health and Service Administration, SAMHSA, also have ongoing funding related to suicide, opioid among young adults, as well as the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which is doing amazing work in all the states in the United States on how to prevent suicide. Chapter focuses on different issues. When it comes to advocacy, I think what we're doing also is part of it, that putting out the word, all of us has to have a concerted effort in destigmatizing mental health and suicide thoughts and behaviors. We need to let everyone know that stress is all part of life. And when individuals are stressful or when they're experiencing mental health, it is important we let them know of ways that they can reach out for help. When you have friends or you know of people who are lonely or have withdrawn from activities that they used to be passionate about, it is important we reach out. We should let people know that it's okay to share their feelings. Sometimes there is a perception that it is only the poor, the marginalized who experience suicide or who are lonely. But what we do know about recent celebrities passing away, that tells us that it goes beyond that. That you could be wealthy, you could be well-to-do, but when you don't have that social support, when you don't have that connection, when you are lonely, you may have thousands of friends on Facebook, on YouTube, but when you don't have that connection, those thousands of individuals will not make you feel supported and welcome. So it is important that we reach out when you know of those who are lonely, who are feeling isolated, reach out. And those who, when people disclose their feelings to us, we should also validate it and refer them to appropriate services. We shouldn't dismiss it. We shouldn't let them feel like, oh, this cannot be true. You can't be experiencing this. Particularly among boys, the perception that boys have to toughen up, have to live up, we need to let them know that it's okay to be emotional. If an adolescent male is emotional, we should let them know that that's okay. Whatever they are feeling, we should validate and refer them to the appropriate services so that they can get help and they can get treatment.
Thank you, Dr. Baiden. I'm going to turn to my colleague, Jacqueline, to pose some audience questions to you now. Jacqueline?
Yes, thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Dr. Baiden, for this great discussion so far on such a tough but important topic. So we have a first question from the audience. I am an advice nurse in a pediatric clinic and often receive calls with kids in crisis. What quick interventions can I offer to youth to ensure safety and well-being?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I would say the quick intervention one will be have a thorough assessment to be able to know the underlying issues. Sometimes even when there seems not to be the issue is not related to suicide thoughts and behaviors. Some of the risk factors, when those are present, should also be something that should engage the attention of clinicians for further assessment and referral. So if the child have a history of abuse, trauma, it's very important that careful attention is paid. And this is where trauma-informed CBT can be very helpful. It addresses the underlying trauma whilst also addressing mental health and suicidal thoughts and behavior. So the first thing will be a thorough assessment of the child to know what are those risk factors that are present. As the child have a history of wanting to die or thoughts about suicide, those has to be addressed. As a child all of a sudden feel like life is not worth living or become hopeless or feeling sad, it needs to be addressed quickly. If the child have been bullied before, it's also important, particularly if it has to do with cyberbullying. The toxic effect of cyberbullying lingers on for so long that it needs to be addressed. So these are some of the host of factors. Beyond addressing that, also there has to be follow-up so that the child is not referred to services and then that should be it. There has to be follow-up to know how is the child feeling. What kind of support mechanism or support system is there for that child? If the child doesn't have a supportive parent or family or friends that he or she can confide in about how he or she is feeling, then efforts should be made to make sure to connect that child to different support mechanisms to help the child.
Great, thank you. A lot of helpful points there. So for our next question, you were touching on vulnerable populations. So this elaborates on that topic. What are the current ages most vulnerable and have the highest rate? And what are the top reasons for suicide in adults and youth?
Yeah, so the vulnerable age, typically the age of adolescent and young adulthood, is considered pretty important. Among adolescents between the ages of 14 and 18, suicide is the third leading cause of death. And among young adults between the ages of 19 to 34, suicide is the second leading cause of death. So this particular age group is very vulnerable. Relating to that is also the certain population are at greater risk than others. And we do know about LGBTQ population as significant risk, as well as Black individuals. And the issue is not just a mere self-identification of an LGBTQ that makes one vulnerable, but the experiences that comes with that, the discrimination, the harassment, the perceived safety concern of the population makes it very difficult that they live their life in constant fear. And this is where, as a society, we need to do better in terms of policies and structures or things that we have that makes life very unbearable for those individuals. The kind of relation an individual have with someone should not predispose that person to be at risk of suicide. But we do see LGBTQ individuals living in constant fear of being harassed. And we do know about states have certain draconian policies that criminalize LGBTQ or that target those population with precision. It makes it very vulnerable. It makes it difficult for those individuals to live a thriving and fulfilling life, and also makes it difficult for them to seek help when they need, because if they are fearful of reaching out to providers to seek services and their identity has to be disclosed and revealed, they may choose not to seek services. The underlying issue may not be suicidal, but if it is mental health, it's depression, anxiety, and they are not seeking early services for those to be treated, then it builds up and makes it very difficult for them and led them to attempt suicide. Same with racial discrimination. When those individuals are discriminated, it becomes very difficult for them to live a thriving life. We do know also about homelessness as also individuals who are homeless as a vulnerable population that is at greater risk of suicide. So those populations are vulnerable and requires a lot of efforts in reaching out to those people, providing services that is friendly for those populations so they can get their help and services.
Great, thank you. On to one topic. I'm not sure if your research focuses on this area, but could you address the relationship of concussions in sports to suicide ideation?
Yeah, thank you. Interestingly, part of my research we did, I think 2 years ago, looks at the impact of concussion, mental health, and suicide among adolescents. And as I've been talking about adverse childhood experiences, the impact adversity have on the brain and how the brain process stress response to life events. We do know about concussion, the impact it has on the brain. And when children are engaged in contact sports, that is very harmful. When they get concussion from those events, it affects their brain and makes them, sometimes they then resort to either using substances to self-medicate, or they develop mental health problems, which also lingers on and later on help them engage in suicide. So when individuals, young adults, adolescents are engaged in contact sports and they have a history of concussion, it's equally important that we pay serious attention to what happened to their brain and how the brain process stress. When we pay attention to that, we can then help them, we connect them with treatment so that the mental health issues that underline or that follows the concussion can be treated, and also constantly let them know about resources that are available. Should they be feeling stressful or should they be experiencing any thought of suicide, they can reach out. But certainly concussion has been shown to play a significant role in terms of exacerbating the risk of suicide, and it also requires that we have to address that. It is good that youth are active, they engage in sports, they play that. But whilst doing that also comes with the injury that is associated with those sports, especially those that involve lots of contact, soccer, football, hockey, lacrosse, and those type of sports that involve contact. We have to make sure that when there's an incident of concussion, we address it holistically and also follow up. The concussion sometimes stays, the magnitude or the effect stays on for sometimes 5 to 10 years. So it's not enough to address it within a year and feel like everything is okay.
Wow. Well, I think that's what we have time for today, Dr. Baiden. I want to thank you. This has been such an informative and important conversation. And we want to stay informed about your work going forward. Thanks so much for joining us, and also to our audience. Before we all leave, we hope you'll join us next week for a very different conversation with Norm Augustine, who is the recipient of the 2024 Herb Hardis Family Award for National Leadership and Advocacy for Research. This is an award recognizing individuals who, like our dear friend, Dr. Pardis, have demonstrated distinguished academic leadership and sustained commitment to public engagement and advocacy for research. Norm has been a leader in the decades-long effort to elevate the priority of research and science in our nation. And he will be interviewed by the Honorable Bart Gordon, a former member of Congress and chair of the House Science Committee, who is also on the Research America board. Bart has been a leader in science and technology advocacy as well. So I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation. Norm Augustine was the CEO of Lockheed Martin and served in various federal and nonprofit roles during his storied career. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. The link is in the chat. And until then, please take care of yourselves, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks again, Dr. Baiden.
Thank you.